In this lesson, we'll talk about predefined constants in VBA, which are also called enumerations. The idea behind an enumeration is tying together a name with a value, or associating a concept with a given number. A good real-life example that I can offer you is ordering food in a fast food restaurant. When you walk into a restaurant and you say something like, "I'd like the number 2, what does that mean? Well, it means that there's some kind of association between the value 2 and some kind of concept or entity. So for example, the number 2 in a fast food restaurant might mean the big burger combo with fries and a soda. It also works in reverse. You may walk in and say, "I'd like the big burger combo," and the waiter or waitress might be able to interpret that as the number 2. So whenever we're associating a name with some kind of value, a number with some kind of concept, we call that an enumeration. Enumerations exist in VBA to help us as developers, and the best way to demonstrate this is with an example. So, as we know, spreadsheets have this concept of orientation. In fact, here in the Excel interface, on the Page Layout tab, we have this orientation option, and we have one of two options, portrait or landscape. We briefly discussed this, I believe, in an assignment in the past where you had to record a macro to change this option. So let's think about the concept of orientation. We have a property on something called a page setup object, which we'll explore very shortly, that allows us to set the orientation of a spreadsheet. But what kind of value is the orientation? Is it a Boolean? Well, not really. Yes, we do have two options here, portrait or landscape, but it's not so much true or false or on or off. It's more just a set of predefined options. It's either portrait or landscape. It's not really a true or false. We also can't really associate a portrait with a given number. We could technically, but what does that mean to us as developers? If we say portrait is equal to the value 5 and landscape is equal to the value 10, and that's how we know which one we're referencing, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to us logically. This is a perfect case for enumeration. We can define essentially a predefined set of values like portrait or landscape, and each one of those values can tie together to a number, and that number is actually what VBA is going to use internally to process our request. And that way, we don't actually have to memorize the concept of relating numbers to portrait or landscape. We just have to identify whether we want portrait or landscape, and that given name will correspond to a given value that VBA can then use. It's a little bit of a confusing concept, so let's explore this actually within the VBA documentation. I'm going to open up my browser here. And I'm actually going to search for right now the worksheet VBA object. We're going to dive into the documentation before we write any of our code. Here is the documentation page for the worksheet object. And on every worksheet object, there exists a property called page setup. So I'm just going to scroll down here until we get to our properties, not our method. So properties, let's look for page setup right here. There it is. So page setup is a property that actually gives back to us a page setup object, yet another object in our Excel object model. Here in our page, we have, of course, the description, returns a page setup object that contains all of the page setup settings for the specified object. Pretty generic documentation, but we can click here. So we're continuing to traverse the Excel object model. Here we're going to get to the page setup object, and this represents the entirety of our actual page setup. So that includes everything from like the left margin, the right margin, the margins, things like the footers, all of that stuff that relates to how that page looks, especially when it's printed. There is a property on the page setup object called orientation. So here it is, orientation. This is how we're going to be altering whether the spreadsheet is going to be in landscape or portrait format, which again is going to affect how it looks when it's printed. And here's a good example. If we take a look at the code here, we see that we're targeting a worksheet, we're targeting the page setup object, we're targeting the orientation property, and here we're setting it to something interesting, Excel landscape. Notice that this isn't a string. We know that automatically because it's not wrapped in double quotes. So what is Excel landscape? Well, it's the idea of an enumeration. This is some kind of name that corresponds to a given value. How can we find out what that is? Well, right here we see that we can use the orientation property to return or set an Excel page orientation value. So what is this thing right here? Let's go one step further, continuing to traverse the object model, and here's where we're actually going to get to the Excel page orientation enumeration again. So what are we doing here? We have a convenient table that corresponds or relates the idea of a name with a value, right? So behind the scenes, whenever we're going to give a name, VBA is going to be able to translate it to a value. And why is this advantageous? Well, because as developers, we don't have to memorize these values. These values are kind of random, right? How do we associate the idea of a landscape with number 2 and a portrait with number 1? We really don't. The VBA community or the developers have just arbitrarily decided that those two values are going to represent those two settings, and we're going to use those two numbers, or rather the code is going to use those two numbers to set some kind of internals of Excel to give that given appearance. But for us as developers, we don't have to actually associate or memorize these values. All we have to do is use the given names, and VBA will translate these names into their numeric values. That's the whole idea of an enumeration. Remember, a name tied to a given numeric value. This is like the Big Burger combo, and we're tying it to number 2 on the menu. So now we can go ahead and see this concept in action in our actual Visual Basic editor. So let's go ahead and define a procedure. I'm going to call it change orientation. Now, in order to get VBA to help us with our actual enumerations and our predefined constants, it's a good idea to define variables that represent Excel objects. That way, IntelliSense can figure out what object we're referring to and show us all of its properties and methods. So what we actually want to target here is the page setup object. So the way I can do that is declare a variable. Let's call it PS for page setup, and we're going to do as page setup. Remember, whenever we're declaring a variable to be an object, whatever's after the as keyword can be any object in the Excel object model. Worksheet, worksheets, workbook, etc. Page setup, as we just saw, is a valid object that's nested within a worksheet. So let's go ahead and set that page setup object. So remember, whenever we're assigning a value to a variable that holds an object, we need to start with the set keyword, set PS, and now I need to target a valid page setup object. Well, we know that exists on an actual worksheet, so we can target a worksheet like worksheets. Let's target sheet 1. As a reminder, whenever we use this syntax, we're automatically going to assume the active workbook, or rather VBA will assume that. That means the workbook that is currently activated or selected. In this case, we only have one open, so by default, it will be the active workbook. All right, and here on a worksheet object, which I've taken out of the collection, we have a property called page setup, which returns to us a valid page setup object. So we've defined that variable, and now whenever we go to PS and place a dot, the IntelliSense is going to show us all of the properties and methods that are available on a page setup object. We, of course, are looking at orientation. So when I do orientation and I do equal, here's where VBA is going to be really helpful. It's going to show us all of the predefined constants or enumerations that are available. Notice here that the values of these constants are irrelevant. We don't know which one of these is represented by number 1 and which one of these is number 2. We have access to that in the VBA documentation, but it doesn't really matter because as developers, we don't have to think about it. We don't have to memorize it. It's abstracted away. That complexity of associating numbers with what is going to happen on the spreadsheet in terms of orientation, the Excel VBA code is going to take care of all of that for us. All we have to do here is just provide the right constant, the right name, and the code under the hood will take care of the rest of the process for us. And the great part about the names is that they're a lot more logical. The number 2, again, doesn't mean anything. However, something like Excel Landscape is kind of logical to us as users. We can associate it with, that means we want the orientation to be of landscape. So let's say I select landscape right here. So I'm just going to select tab. That should lock it into place. Let's just double check that our orientation right now is set to portrait perfectly. Perfect. So what's going to happen here is we're going to change the orientation from the default right now, which is portrait, to landscape. And we're going to do that using this predefined constant or this enumeration. All right, let's go ahead and execute this, F5. Now we're not going to see anything visibly, but if I go here in orientation, we can see that it's been swapped to landscape. Let's go ahead and switch that back to portrait. I'm just going to remove this value right here. Once again, type an equal sign, and there again, we're going to see 2 values. Now, kind of as an obvious reminder, depending on the property that we're going to be accessing, we're going to see a different set of available predefined constants or enumerations. It all depends on the property that we're adjusting. There are enumerations related to navigating across the worksheet. There are enumerations related to charts and tables. They're all just predefined options, predefined values that map or relate to a given name. That allows us to not have to think about the number and only have to process the name that we need. So what do we want to do now? Well, we want to change the orientation to portrait. We can safely guess as a developer that Excel Portrait is the one that corresponds with the portrait orientation. We can select that. Again, under the hood, behind the scenes, Microsoft's code will translate this to a number. It's going to know what to do with that number in order to turn the orientation of the worksheet into a portrait. So when I execute this, F5, Check here, the orientation has been changed back to portrait. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about the idea of predefined constants, also called enumerations. We're going to be seeing this concept a lot throughout the course. Again, these constants exist whenever we have a value that's a little bit difficult to represent with something simple like a string or a number. We could, of course, tie together the idea of an orientation with a number, but what would that mean, right? What the heck does a number 2 mean when it comes to portrait? We're really just trying to represent a limited set of options, kind of a list of possible values, but a number isn't really perfect. A string is kind of functional, but again, typing in a string like portrait doesn't always work. What if the user enters a typo, things like that? So the reason that these constants exist, these enumerations, is so that we have these predefined things that we as developers can use that are less likely to run into errors. And behind the scenes, VBA will just translate these names to given values, and it knows what to do with them to accomplish the effect that we want. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.